It was August 1945. The Pacific War had ended, but for thousands of Japanese soldiers now held as prisoners of war. The fighting had not truly stopped. It had only shifted inside their minds. In camps scattered across the Philippines, Borneo, and the Pacific Islands, dawn broke with a silence that felt heavier than the gunfire that once filled their lives. The war was over, yet these men stood in foreign soil behind barbed wire, uncertain if they were the lucky ones or merely survivors waiting for judgment. As the first rays of light pierced the humid tropical air, guards ordered the Japanese POWs to form ranks. The ground was damp with dew, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The smell of rust, sweat, and sea salt mixed with the faint scent of smoke rising from distant cooking fires. The men, once soldiers of the Empire of Japan, stood in worn uniforms, their insignia stripped away, their eyes hollow but proud. Some whispered prayers to ancestors. Others stared at the horizon, trying to recall the faces of families they hadn't seen in years. No one knew what awaited them that morning. Whispers spread that a transport ship had arrived, perhaps repatriation, perhaps punishment. Their captors gave no explanation. Only the order came: line up at dawn. As the sun climbed higher, shadows shortened across the compound, marking the passage of another uncertain day in captivity. For the men standing there, that morning would change everything. Not through violence, but through the sudden realization of what defeat truly meant. It was still early when the sound of boots on gravel echoed through the camp. A grey dawn hung low over the barbed wire fences, and the faint glow of sunlight struggled to break through the heavy clouds above. The prisoners had been awake long before the guards arrived. Sleep was a rare luxury in those days. Each rustle of movement, each sudden shout from a sentry could stir the entire camp into restless alertness. The Japanese prisoners knew that something awaited them this morning. The orders had been clear the night before. All prisoners are to assemble at dawn. No reason was given, and no one dared to ask why. By the time the whistle blew, hundreds of men had already stepped out of their bamboo huts and makeshift shelters. They fell into lines with the practiced precision of soldiers who once followed commands as sacred duty. Even in captivity, old habits clung tightly to them. Backs straight, heads low, eyes fixed ahead. For years they had fought under the rising sun, carrying the belief that capture was a disgrace worse than death. Now, stripped of their weapons, their uniforms faded and torn, their empire defeated, they stood as prisoners, men suspended between war and peace, honor and humiliation. A humid wind blew through the camp, carrying the mixed scents of salt and smoke from the nearby coastline. Somewhere beyond the fences, waves crashed faintly against the shore. The sound reminded them of home, of Japan's islands, the fishing villages, and the families they left behind. But home felt impossibly far away, hidden behind oceans of loss. As the men stood in silence, the gates at the far end of the compound creaked open. Several Allied officers entered, their boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. They walked with quiet authority, clipboards in hand, their eyes scanning the assembled rows of prisoners. Behind them trailed a few interpreters, Filipino and British, their expressions hard to read. For the Japanese POWs, these men were symbols of victory, living proof that the empire which had promised eternal dominion now lay in ruins. One officer, a tall Australian with weathered skin, raised a loudspeaker. His voice cracked through the air, firm and deliberate. "You will remain silent. You will listen carefully. Orders are to be followed without question." The words were translated into Japanese moments later by an interpreter. The tone carried no cruelty, only the unmistakable weight of control. The officer continued. Each man will be processed for transfer. Medical inspection will follow. You will be relocated as directed. You will receive food and water after orders are complete. A few prisoners exchanged glances. They had heard rumors. Some said they would be sent to Manila, others to Australia or to faraway islands for labor. But no one truly knew their fate. The officer's voice was mechanical, stripped of emotion. It wasn't meant to comfort or threaten, it was simply procedure. The language of victors managing the aftermath of war. Among the rows of prisoners stood Lieutenant Kenji, once a proud officer in the Imperial Japanese Army. He had commanded a small unit during the defense of Button. Now, his uniform hung loose on his thin frame, his insignia torn away. His eyes, once sharp and defiant, carried the dullness of exhaustion. Yet when the order came to stand at attention, his spine instinctively straightened. He glanced at the men around him. Some still bore scars from battle, others from the months of starvation and disease that followed their surrender. They were not soldiers anymore, yet some part of them refused to let go of that identity. Behind the ranks, the sound of papers rustling and pens scratching filled the air. The Allied clerks recorded each prisoner's name, rank, and origin. Oki watched as a fellow soldier, once his subordinate, was asked to step forward. The man's voice trembled slightly as he gave his name. The interpreter nodded, translating for the clerk. Next, the process moved slowly. Sweat rolled down faces despite the early hour. The tropical air was thick and unmoving. A guard passed by with a rifle slung casually over his shoulder, the bayonet glinting faintly in the light. No threats were spoken, but none were needed. The prisoners understood their position too well. As the lists grew, so did the silence. Only the occasional cough or the clatter of a metal cup broke the stillness. Then came a sound, a faint rhythmic thump from beyond the fence. A truck approached, its engine sputtering before settling into an idle growl. Dust rose from the dirt road as it stopped near the entrance. 2 more trucks followed, their wooden beds empty except for ropes and crates stacked neatly at the back. The arrival of the vehicles stirred unease among the men. The guards motioned for several rows to step forward. "Move!" the interpreter barked. They obeyed, their movements stiff and mechanical. Each group was led toward a small table where another officer checked their identification. Afterward, they were told to sit and wait by the trucks. Oki watched the scene unfold, his mind drifting back to the war's final days. He remembered the radio announcement, the Emperor's voice declaring Japan's surrender. For hours afterward, he and his men sat in stunned disbelief, unable to comprehend what they had heard. To them, surrender was unimaginable. Now, standing in this foreign camp, he realized that their war had not ended in a single moment. It had simply changed shape. As the sun climbed higher, its heat settled heavily over the camp. Flies gathered near puddles, and the men shifted uncomfortably. A guard passed by offering canteens of water, but there was little conversation. The prisoners kept their eyes low, their thoughts inward. One of the Allied officers, a young American barely out of his 20s, watched them carefully. He had fought in the Pacific and had lost friends to the very army that now stood before him in silence. Yet as he observed the prisoners, thin, weary, stripped of everything, he felt something unexpected pity. These were no longer the fierce soldiers of propaganda, they were just men, broken, humbled, enduring the slow erosion of pride. Hours passed before the final list was read. Those who were to remain behind, officers, medics, and suspected war criminals, were separated from the rest. The remaining men were told to prepare for transport within 2 days. There was no applause, no cheer, no visible relief. The announcement only deepened the quiet tension. Oki turned his gaze toward the horizon. In the distance, beyond the barbed wire, he could see palm trees swaying gently in the wind. Birds circled overhead, oblivious to the human sorrow below. Somewhere out there, beyond the sea, was Japan, his home, his family, his life before the war. Would they still recognize him now? Would they even still be alive? That night, as darkness settled over the camp, the prisoners gathered around the few lanterns that flickered weakly in the humid air. Conversations were hushed, words chosen carefully. Some men whispered about the future, others about the past. One soldier quietly recited a poem about the homeland, his voice barely audible above the hum of insects. For the first time, Oki noticed how their voices no longer carried the arrogance of soldiers who believed in destiny. Instead, they spoke as men trying to understand what remained of their humanity. Defeat had taken more than victory ever could. The next morning, the same routine followed. Roll call, inspection, silence. But something had changed in their faces, an understanding that whatever awaited them next, they would endure it together. They were not heroes nor martyrs. They were simply witnesses to the collapse of everything they had once believed in. When the officer's voice rang out again, it sounded distant, almost detached. "You will be moved soon. You will follow instructions as before." The prisoners nodded silently. Oki felt a strange calm settle over him. There was no longer anything left to resist. As the men stood in the blinding sunlight, a sudden gust of wind swept through the compound, stirring the dust and rustling the tattered Japanese flags that some prisoners had secretly kept hidden. For a fleeting moment, the air carried the scent of salt and home. Oki closed his eyes, letting it linger. He thought of his wife, his son, faces now blurred by time. That morning would be remembered not for violence, but for its stillness. The stillness of men learning to accept the weight of defeat. The stillness of soldiers stripped of purpose, yet standing tall out of habit. The stillness before the uncertain journey that awaited them beyond the wire. And in that silence beneath the pale blue sky, hundreds of Japanese POWs finally understood what their captors could never teach them. The true cost of war is not in death, but in the long, unending life that follows. Engines roared to life as the morning haze lifted, revealing the convoy of military trucks parked just outside the camp's main gate. Their faded olive, green paint bore the marks of months of use, chipped and dulled by tropical rain and heat. Dust swirled in the air as guards moved briskly between the vehicles and the assembled ranks of Japanese prisoners. It was a sight that captured the strange aftermath of war. Men once feared across Asia, now standing barefoot in mud, their heads lowered, awaiting orders from their former enemies. The trucks had come to take them away, but to where none of the prisoners knew. The previous night, rumors had swept through the camp like wildfire. Some whispered that the Allies were sending them home, that their long ordeal was finally ending. Others, more cautious, said that only a few would return to Japan, while the rest would be detained for questioning about war crimes. The uncertainty gnawed at every man. Each time a name was called, a dozen others held their breath, unsure whether that man's fate was fortune or punishment. The commanding officer, a British colonel, stepped forward to address the gathered prisoners. His words were translated by a Japanese interpreter who spoke with an uneasy calm. "You will now be sorted into groups. Those chosen for transfer will board the trucks. You will obey all instructions. Anyone attempting to flee or disobey will be shot." The message, though simple, carried the heavy finality of law. The men responded in silence, their faces unreadable. One by one, rows of prisoners were called forward. The colonel and his assistants held files thick with reports, names, ranks, divisions, and intelligence gathered since the Japanese surrender. Some prisoners were recognized immediately by their captors. Others had been noted in interrogations conducted in the weeks before. The decisions were swift and impersonal. A nod meant relocation. A shake of the head meant detention. Lieutenant Kenji Oki, who had stood near the center of the line the previous day, was among the first to be called. He stepped forward, his knees weak from hunger, but his movements steady. The officer in charge looked at him, then down at his papers. "Bataan?" 1942, the officer said quietly to himself. He gestured for Oki to step aside. No explanation, no accusation. Just a motion of the hand that decided his future. Oki joined a small group of men who were told to wait near the edge of the camp. Around him, the selection continued. Some men were visibly relieved when told they would be repatriated. They bowed respectfully, grateful simply to be alive. Others were pale with dread, knowing that transfer could mean interrogation, or worse. The line between innocence and guilt had become blurred in those chaotic months after Japan's surrender. Many of these men had merely obeyed orders. Yet, in the eyes of their captors, obedience had often been the face of cruelty. By mid-morning, the camp buzzed with confusion. Prisoners whispered among themselves, trying to decipher the pattern in the selections. But there was none. The Allied officers worked from lists prepared by intelligence units, lists based on incomplete reports, fragments of testimony, and the uncertain fog of war. A sergeant who had once served in a logistics unit was pulled aside for questioning about supply routes. A medic was detained for alleged mistreatment of prisoners, and a cook, to everyone's disbelief, was marked for transfer to a labor camp. The trucks stood waiting in the heat, their engines idling. The men selected for departure climbed aboard under guard, each carrying a small bundle of belongings, ration tins, photographs, or scraps of paper with scribbled addresses. The drivers shouted to one another, checking the fuel lines and counting heads. Dust and diesel fumes filled the air. Inside the trucks, silence prevailed. The wooden planks beneath their feet were rough and splintered. Some men stared blankly at the horizon through the open slats in the truck's side. Others bowed their heads, murmuring silent prayers. For the first time, many of them realized that their destiny was no longer in their own hands. Back at the camp, those not chosen stood in uneasy groups. The separation had carved an invisible line between them. One man, a former corporal from Kyushu, broke the silence. "Those trucks," he whispered. "They may not be going home. I've heard they take men to the coast for questioning. Some don't return." His words drew fearful looks but no replies. In a world built on obedience, speculation was dangerous. When the final list was read, over half the prisoners had been assigned to the trucks. The rest were ordered to remain for further screening. The guards shouted commands, directing movements with curt gestures. As the first convoy began to roll out, the camp fell silent except for the low hum of the engines. Oki watched from the back of one truck as the camp's gates opened. Beyond the wire lay a landscape he had barely noticed before. Dense palms, scorched fields, and the distant outline of a small fishing village. He realized, with a strange detachment, that this was the first time in months he had seen anything beyond fences. Freedom, however partial, felt almost unfamiliar. The convoy moved slowly along a dirt road that wound through the tropical countryside. Soldiers with rifles sat in the truck's rear corners, their eyes constantly scanning the trees. The Japanese prisoners sat opposite one another, knees touching, their faces drawn and hollow. Nobody spoke. The air was heavy with the scent of oil and dust. For hours they traveled through terrain scarred by war. Burned-out vehicles littered the roadside, and small villages appeared like ghosts of the past, shattered homes, collapsed bridges, and rusting helmets half buried in mud. Occasionally, locals watched from a distance, their expressions guarded. Some of them had suffered under Japanese occupation. Now, seeing their former oppressors as captives, they looked on with silent judgment. At one stop, the trucks halted for inspection. The prisoners were ordered out and told to stand by the road. Allied guards handed out canteens of water and small rations of biscuits. It was a meager offering, but to men who had survived starvation, it felt like a feast. Oki took a sip of the warm water and closed his eyes. The taste of metal lingered, but for that brief moment, it was life. A British officer approached and addressed them. "You are being moved to a holding facility near the coast," he said. "Those who pass medical inspection and clearance will be sent home to Japan. The rest will be processed as required." His tone was flat, rehearsed, one of routine bureaucracy. Yet for the men listening, it sounded like the verdict of fate itself. Hours later, as the convoy neared the coast, the scent of the sea grew stronger. Waves shimmered under the late afternoon sun, and seagulls circled above the harbor. For the first time, the prisoners could see ships anchored offshore, gray silhouettes against the horizon. The sight stirred mixed emotions. Some men smiled faintly, imagining the possibility of returning home. Others turned away, fearing the worst. The trucks came to a stop near a fenced compound surrounded by American guards. Signs written in English and Japanese marked the area as a processing and repatriation center. The prisoners were unloaded, lined up, and divided once more into smaller groups. Doctors in khaki uniforms moved through the lines, inspecting their eyes, skin, and posture. Medical orderlies noted fevers, infections, and wounds that had never properly healed. Oki felt the doctor's gloved hand on his wrist as his pulse was checked. The man said something in English. Oki didn't understand, but the nod that followed gave him some comfort. He was marked with chalk on the shoulder. Cleared. He didn't know what it meant yet, but at least it wasn't rejection. Nearby, a smaller group of prisoners was separated for questioning. They were escorted to a tent where Allied intelligence officers waited with files and translators. The atmosphere inside those tents was tense, almost suffocating. The prisoners were not tortured or beaten, the Allies followed procedure. But the questions, sharp, unrelenting, cut deeper than any physical blow. They were asked about unit movements, camp conditions, executions. Some broke down in tears. Others simply stared at the ground, their voices hollow. Those who emerged from the tents carried faces drained of emotion. They said nothing as they rejoined the others. Oki saw in their eyes something he recognized all too well. The look of men who had glimpsed the machinery of judgment and realized how powerless they truly were. Night fell before the final groups were processed. The prisoners were led to a series of large tents near the shore. Inside, rows of wooden cots lined the floor. The sound of the ocean drifted through the canvas walls, a haunting reminder of the world beyond. Guards walked the perimeter with lanterns, their shadows flickering across the sand. As Oki lay on his cot, exhaustion pressing down on him, he thought of Japan. He imagined stepping onto its soil again, seeing the shattered remains of Tokyo, the faces of those who had survived, the emptiness left by those who had not. The war had ended, but for men like him, it had carved a scar that would never truly fade. In the tent beside his, 2 soldiers whispered quietly. One said he feared returning home, that his village would despise him for surrendering. The other said he feared never returning at all. Between them lay the heavy silence of shame, something deeper than defeat. The next morning, a new list was read. The first group of prisoners was to board ships bound for Japan. The names were called slowly, deliberately. When Oki's came, he rose without expression. His legs trembled slightly, but his heart was steady. He had survived the jungle, starvation, and battle. He would now face what came next, the reality of peace. Those left behind watched silently as the selected men marched toward the docks. The air was filled with the rhythmic sound of boots on sand. No one spoke. No one waved. They had learned that farewells in times like these carried no certainty. Oki paused once, glancing back at the camp, the fences, the guards, the faces of comrades who would not be joining him. Then, turning toward the sea, he stepped forward into the unknown. The waves glistened under the morning sun, indifferent to the pain of men. The ships waited quietly at anchor, their decks crowded with figures in tattered uniforms. As the engines began to rumble, Oki felt the deck shift beneath his feet. The shoreline began to recede. He didn't know what awaited him in Japan, perhaps nothing but ruin. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt something faintly familiar stirring within him. Not hope, exactly, but perhaps the beginning of acceptance. The night descended slowly over the POW camp, bringing with it a humid stillness that pressed against the prisoners' tired bodies. Lanterns flickered weakly, casting long, wavering shadows across the bamboo huts and the rough, hewn wooden cots inside the larger tents. The men had been processed, some cleared for repatriation, others detained for further investigation or labor assignments. Yet despite the exhaustion that weighed on their shoulders, few could find rest. Sleep, when it came, was shallow, broken by distant murmurs, the scraping of guards' boots, or the restless sighs of men wrestling with memories that would not fade. Lieutenant Kenji Oki lay on a cot near the edge of the tent, the coarse fabric beneath him scratching at his skin. His arms were folded behind his head as he stared upward, watching the shadows of palm fronds dance across the canvas roof. The faint hum of the nearby ocean reached him, a reminder that the world continued beyond these walls, beyond captivity, beyond the defeat that now defined him. Every sound carried meaning. The distant bark of a guard, the scrape of a chair, the whisper of a fellow prisoner recounting an event from months or years before. In these small noises, he found connection and isolation all at once. Around the camp, small groups of men had formed, drawn together by proximity and shared circumstance. A former sergeant from Osaka sat cross-legged, quietly inspecting the stitching of his worn uniform. He hummed a faint tune his mother used to sing, a song about rice paddies and the scent of spring blossoms. Beside him, a private recited the names of his fallen comrades, almost in prayer, almost as a way to keep memory alive in a place where past identities were stripped away. Some men exchanged glances that spoke volumes. No words were needed. Here hierarchy and rank had dissolved. Officers and enlisted men, once separated by rigid protocol, now shared the same vulnerability, the same quiet fear. Orki turned his gaze toward a small group of prisoners huddled around a dim lantern. They spoke in hushed tones about home. Kyushu, Hokkaido, Shikoku. One man spoke of a sister who had sent letters he never received, another of a wife who may have remarried. The stories were fragmentary, often ending in uncertainty, but they were a lifeline. In these confessions, the prisoners reclaimed fragments of themselves, memories that could not be erased by capture or defeat. The camp, once a place of order and discipline, had become a fragile community of shared reflection. The air carried a mix of sweat, damp earth, and smoke from small fires where some men had lit bits of ration fuel to cook a meager meal. The smell was overpowering in the enclosed spaces, yet comforting in a strange way. It was a scent of survival, of continuation despite all odds. Orki could hear the clatter of metal utensils against tin plates, punctuated by occasional murmurs of laughter. A rare sound, brief and fragile, yet unmistakable in its humanity. Outside the tent, the night sky stretched wide and dark, punctuated by stars that shimmered above the barbed wire. The sound of waves reached the camp with a rhythmic constancy, whispering into the quiet. Some men walked to the fences, peering through the gaps at the distant horizon. Others stayed close to the firelight, warming their hands and silently contemplating what lay ahead. The juxtaposition of freedom just beyond reach and the reality of their confinement pressed heavily on their minds. Orki found himself reflecting on the war's final moments. The surrender had been swift, almost surreal. For decades, soldiers had been trained to view surrender as dishonor, yet now, standing here, Orki understood that survival was its own victory. The men around him had endured more than bullets. They had endured fear, hunger, disease, and uncertainty. Each man bore a story of loss and endurance, etched deeply into his face, posture, and quiet demeanor. The conversations around the camp were sporadic. Some prisoners shared memories of combat, not in a boastful way, but as a means of coping. One recounted a night in Borneo where he and his unit had been forced to march for days without water. Another spoke of an ambush he had barely survived, remembering the faces of those who did not make it. Each tale carried the weight of memory, yet was told with a calm acceptance. The recounting was not prideful. It was a way to humanize themselves to one another, to affirm that they had lived. Even when death had shadowed them so closely, Orki noticed the transformation in the men as the night deepened. Earlier in captivity, they had moved with caution, as if every action was scrutinized. Now, stripped of the immediate pressures of guards and orders, their demeanor softened. Men who had once clutched the notion of honor above all else now laughed quietly at shared jokes, shared memories, and the absurdities of their circumstances. There was a collective recognition that the war was over, but the human struggle had not yet ceased. He thought about those who had been selected for war crime investigations. The fear in their eyes was unmistakable, a mixture of guilt, confusion, and dread. Others would never leave the camp, bound instead to labor or extended captivity. For those heading home, there was relief, but it was tempered with apprehension. How would Japan receive them? What remained of their families, their homes, their lives? The answers were uncertain, and the unknown stretched ahead like the dark sea beyond the camp walls. By the small hours of the night, the men settled into routines born of necessity. Some wrote letters on scraps of paper, hoping their words would reach loved ones across oceans. Some tended to wounds or washed the grime from months of labor. Others simply lay awake, listening to the night and the breathing of fellow prisoners, finding solace in the shared presence of survival. Oki closed his eyes for a brief moment, allowing himself to feel the steady pulse of life around him. Lantern light flickered across the canvas walls, casting shadows that danced across faces etched with exhaustion, hope, and sorrow. In those fleeting moments, the camp felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary of shared endurance. The men had survived the horrors of war, but now faced a subtler struggle, the confrontation with what it meant to live after conflict. Oki spoke softly to the man beside him, a former corporal who had served in a remote garrison. "Do you think we'll see home?" The question hung in the air. The corporal nodded slightly but said nothing. Words were inadequate. Silence, shared in understanding, became the language of this moment. They had learned that some things could only be felt, not expressed. As dawn approached again, the camp remained quiet, almost reverent in its stillness. The prisoners gathered their few belongings, prepared to face the next stage of their uncertain journeys. Even in the absence of orders, they moved with the discipline that had once made them soldiers. Each step was measured, each glance intentional, as they absorbed the lessons of survival, defeat, and the fragile bonds forged in captivity. Oki rose to look at the distant horizon, the pale light beginning to illuminate the waves beyond. He thought of all the men beside him, each with a story of endurance, and realized that the shared human experience, the quiet suffering, the fleeting comforts, the resilience, was what connected them now. No longer captains or privates, enemies or allies, they were simply men, bearing the weight of a world transformed by war. In that night's quiet, under the dim lanterns and the vast, indifferent sky, the prisoners understood a profound truth: survival was not just about living. It was about enduring, reflecting, and holding on to fragments of humanity when everything else had been stripped away. They had survived the battlefields, yet now they faced the long, silent struggle of living with memory, guilt, loss, and hope. Even as the camp slept under the pale glow of dawn, the men's hearts carried the echoes of the past. Each quiet conversation, each whispered memory, each shared glance was a testament to the human spirit's persistence, and in that reflection they found the courage to continue,